this is going to be a somewhat of a hot button topic here. This is about police brutality against black people and just police brutality overall. In the 1960s and even the late 50s, people were addressing police brutality, whether it was Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., or even James Baldwin. And despite the fact that police brutality has existed for decades, what seems to be interesting is that they got away with their crimes back then, and they are still getting a slap on the wrist today. So the fact that Malcolm X was addressing the issue of police brutality, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. The fact that they were saying these same things 60 years ago are the same things people are still discussing today. Which means not much has changed as far as racism, as well as police brutality. There's only one minor difference when it comes to police brutality, is that police officers don't just target black people anymore. They attack Hispanics, and even Muslims were victims of hate crime, which has been prevalent in 2003, but still not many people didn't even know about it because it was just swept under the rug and completely forgotten and censored in the mainstream media. And it was only mentioned in one or two pages of the Time magazine in 2000, New York Times magazine in 2003. But you know what's actually funny? Even white people are victims of police brutality, believe it or not. So that's the only small difference, is that nowadays police brutality targets everybody, but the main target still happens to be black people. But what still remains the same is that when a black person when a police officer commits a crime such as first-degree murder, they go to jail, or should I say in this case, the judge sentences them for, a couple decades in prison. But then that decision, after the verdict has passed and voted unanimous by the jury as guilty of second or first degree murder, the decision is suddenly reversed within a matter of weeks or months. Now I'm going to say this again. When the judge declares a police officer guilty of committing a first or second degree murder, even when the evidence is right there, even when the jury votes and decides that that police officer should be guilty of second or first degree murder, even after that passes, somehow the judge still decides to reverse it so that they could just get a slap on the wrist and let them go. Now this comes to tell you right there that police officers, as far as abusing their power, they get away. The really evil and the bad police officers, they get away with crimes, and they only get punished with a slap on the wrist. Now I know for a fact that there are many good police officers out there, even the ones who, even if there's a video that went viral of a police officer doing a good act, people forget about it because people focus on the bad things police officers do. However, when police officers get away with crimes, you just have to think to yourself, this is something they've been getting away with for the past 75 years in the United States, or even more. When a black guy is a victim of police brutality, whether it is splitting a victim's head open with their clubs and their batons, like what happened with Ronald Stokes, and even Johnson Hinton in 1957 in Harlem, New York City, who later on sued the New York Police Department for $70,000 at that time in 1957, then it's safe to say that police officers, they get away with these kind of things. And the worst thing that can happen is like, oh, they're going to be filed for there's going to be a civil lawsuit set against them. So as far as police brutality goes, not much has changed because they still get away with crimes that they commit. They break the law as oath keepers. They also break the law as far as being people who serve the community, as they have sworn an oath, and they have sworn an oath to do that. But when they abuse their power and just abuse someone, a victim, then I think it's safe to say that they have gotten away with it. They get away with it all the time. Did that with Ronald Stokes. They did that during the civil rights movement when they attacked the civil rights protesters who were marching with dogs and fire hoses and clubs. So I find, and even during the LA riots, this also happened. So I find that a little bit strange that in 60 years, nothing has changed to this day. Even during the case of George Floyd, when he kept telling the officer, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Within 4 minutes, he was dead. But he had a knee on his neck for 9 minutes. And I thought, you see, I thought it was a tremendous breakthrough at first that all the officers will be charged with second-degree murder, and they will be spending decades in prison. Of course, when it was announced that they will soon be released, after the judge obviously reversed that decision, that tells me right there that police officers will continue to get away with crimes against black people, or anybody for that matter, not just black people. For as long as they have a badge, they can get away with just a slap on the wrist. Now, I don't know about you, but last I checked, a slap on the wrist is not exactly a good example of retribution. So really, there either needs to be police reform, or lots and lots of money that's being spent on funding police departments needs to receive a tremendous cutback. Because as far as I'm concerned, the fact that they can get away with crimes or what have you, it's not even fair. Of course, what I also don't agree with is the fact that they're being attacked in New York City. I mean, activists and rioters are just throwing stuff and they're beating them to a bloody pulp to the point where they're actually bleeding. So that tells me right there that these police officers, they really, really need to know what they're doing. But of course, when I learned of this update, which was just 2 weeks ago or last week, that George Floyd himself not only died, but the fact that the police officers are all going to get away with a slap on the wrist, I find this a little bit funny. And of course, I wasn't surprised, because this is what happened with Laquan McDonald. When that 16-year-old kid literally got 16 shots to his body, got shot 16 times, because a 16-year-old kid was seen as a threat, so they had to put an end to that threat by shooting him, 16 times. I think it's safe to assume that after 3 years, justice was served, but then it was reversed. This tells me that the system itself is nothing more than a joke. And, they may take punishment for crimes very seriously, but I think punishments for those who don't wear a badge are heavily inflicted upon those who actually wear a badge. And that to me tells me that this is not fair and this is a complete bias. As a matter of fact, if a white person committed a crime, they wouldn't get a slap on the wrist just because they don't have a badge, or they weren't wearing a badge before. But when an officer wears a badge, well, they can get away with crimes. They tend to get a slap on the wrist all the time, or should I say a lot of the time? Maybe not most of the time or all the time, but a lot of the time they do get a slap on the wrist. But of course, there are many police officers out there who didn't get away with it. Some police officers have been charged with child pornography, and they got the minimal requirement as far as being put put behind bars in prison. So that was one of the few examples where some police officers got their so-called just desserts. For any of you who are familiar with that expression. So, with that being said, the fact that this was reversed, George Floyd's family obviously is going to file a civil lawsuit against the police department that was involved in the murder and the arrest of George Floyd. And the fact that they can also get a slap on the wrist, even after they had a no search warrant and broke into Breonna Taylor's house and shot her in her own home. What that tells me is that the system is somehow against criminals who happen to be thugs, but they only support the thugs that they see as doing good for the system. So thugs do deserve their punishment. They deserve to be arrested. But if a police officer turns into a thug, why doesn't he get the same punishment as any other criminal out there? Doesn't make any sense to me. So what all these civil rights and activists have been preaching about police brutality 60 years ago, nothing has changed, because police officers, they still get away with the crimes that they've committed before. That tells me nothing has changed. A police officer, even if they go to jail, and if they were sentenced like 40 years behind bars after a slap on the wrist, they get out of jail in 4 months. In 4 months they leave. Even if they murder the white kid, even if they murdered a teenager who happens to be white or Hispanic, they'll still get away with a slap on the wrist. Doesn't matter. Police brutality, doesn't discriminate against anybody. Black, white, Hispanic, or even Asian for that matter. They shot some Pakistani immigrants in 2003 because of the fact they were Muslims. That's why they got shot. And this happened in New York City in 2003, which is not exactly that long ago. That's considered recent history. That was only 17 years ago. 17 years ago is not that long ago at all. That was just 17 years ago. That's not old history. That's like recent history right there. 75 years ago is considered recent history. They make it seem like it was so long ago that racism was still a thing in the 1970s or whatever it is, but police brutality was a thing in the 60s and 50s even. So how is this even different? It's not different. It's the same thing. They keep getting away with this stuff. So there should be a reform, and there should be a cutback, and they shouldn't be so militarized to the point where they stop serving the community as human beings. Because the only police officers who do that just so happen to be oath keepers. Those are the only ones who do that. That's it. So with that being said, I'm not really going to sugarcoat it any further. But if you guys think that America has changed that much since the 1960s, I think you're sorely mistaken. There's less racism compared to the 1960s by far, but it's still very, very prevalent. It's alive and well in the South. There's in even some parts of the Midwest, there's no question about it. It still exists. So you can't sit there and tell me that it doesn't, when clearly the fact of the matter is, it really, really does. So really, I don't care. You guys can say whatever you want, but not that much progress has been made since the 60s or even since the 50s. There's still, the only difference is that police officers, police departments are getting sued more, Um, they attack black people are no longer the main target of police brutality. Well, they are the main target, but it's not just black people that they target when it comes to police brutality. And interracial dating or interracial marriage is no longer considered a crime, nor is it considered illegal anymore. But in some parts of the South, it still is, unfortunately. So those are few minor differences, but other than that, nothing. For the most part, nothing really has changed. Racism is still alive and well. There's still so many racists here in America. They just don't voice it. It's just not that loud. Racism is quiet. You always tell when they give you that look, like, you know. So that's just how it is. So when somebody looks over like this, that means you know that there's going to be some racial tension in the room. So I find this a little bit weird how nobody wants to point this out, and people make it seem like the 1960s was so long ago. If we're talking about like nostalgia and childhood memories, then yeah, you could say that was a long time ago. But as far as recent history, 60 years ago was very recent in terms of history. So, or should I say, in terms of going back in time or reliving history, it's not that long ago. It was just 60 years ago. I'm not saying that everything that America's not a good country or whatever. I mean, every country has its flaws, but a lot of people seem to ignore the fact that there's a lot of progress that's still yet to be made. Anyway, that's my rant, and that's what I have to say about police brutality. Anyway, take care, and I hope you guys had some kind of new perspective on police brutality because, like I said, not much has changed. Really, nothing has changed. So, there has to be police reform. There has to be a cutback with the police budget. Um, and obviously there needs to be less over surveillance in areas of poverty. I mean, in other areas, there are many areas of poverty, whether it's West Virginia or other places in the dirty South or whatever it is. Still, so many places that have never been under surveillance, and usually they commit crimes worse than what you even see in Harlem. I'm pretty sure there is, whether it's Detroit or even Mississippi. Mississippi being number two, like in one of the most dangerous places in America. Of course, Detroit will still be number one. Anyway, went on long enough. Take care.